The Road Rash series was born in 1991 and developed by EA Electronic Arts that provided a new fresh take on the racing genre, originally beginning on the Sega Mega Drive, with players brawling on motorcycles as you speed down highways, cityscapes and countryside lanes, swinging chains and bats at rival bikers, dodging police while trying to secure first place. Your goal is not just to cross the finish line, but to survive the chaos as you try to finish in one piece. On the Sega Mega Drive, Road Rash stood out with its pseudo 3D graphics and visuals, scaling and sprite techniques to create the illusion of speed and depth, which was a big deal back then with its innovative combat mechanics and intense gameplay, along with hilarious ragdoll crashes and the ability to knock opponents off their bikes with weapons like clubs and chains made it an instant hit. It was gritty, rebellious and pure adrenaline fueled, setting a new standard for arcade style racing games. The success of Road Rash led to a string of sequels and ports, as EA saw real potential and began expanding it onto other platforms, with the Sega Master System, Game Gear, and even as far as the Amiga and Nintendo Game Boy. In 1994, the Sega CD version introduced full motion video cutscenes and a revamped soundtrack that gave the game more edge, but things really kicked into a high gear with the Panasonic 3DO version, also releasing in 1994. It was a massive leap forward in terms of visuals and sound. For many, this was the definitive Road Rash experience, with crisp graphics, brutal animations, and an iconic licensed soundtrack featuring bands like Soundgarden and Paw, among many others. This version of Road Rash would later find its way also to the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn in 1995, and later in 1996 on the PC, to the delight of fans, as these versions kept the spirit of the game alive while refining the graphics and gameplay for a new generation of players. The introduction of more realistic physics with expanded tracks and detailed environments made these versions feel like the future of arcade racing. There would be some subtle differences in the Saturn and PC versions, however, but would still be seen as a solid and fun experience. But we can't discuss this iconic series without also talking about its memorable music tracks, because Road Rash wasn't just about the gameplay, it was also about attitude. The series featured killer soundtracks that perfectly matched the chaos on screen, from original compositions with heavy rock vibes to licensed tracks by big name artists. The music was always the highlight. Who could forget listening to tracks like Rusty Cage by Soundgarden? The energy of the music made every race feel like a concert on wheels, and honestly the soundtracks are worth revisiting today. Fans and music composers have even gone as far as to remaster and rework their own versions of the themes from the racetracks themselves in recent times, more so with the earlier titles on the Sega Mega Drive, which presents mixes of nostalgia with adding heavy rock elements that would be the perfect addition to the modern era of the series. Well worth a listen to if you get a chance. As the gaming industry moved into the late 90s and early 2000s, the series would go through many changes to move away from the pseudo 3D visuals in favour of full 3D gameplay aesthetics, with games like Road Rash 3D, Road Rash 64 and Road Rash Jailbreak that experimented with new ideas, but at the same time they didn't fully capture the earlier title's magic. In saying that, the series' final entry with Road Rash Jailbreak releasing on the PlayStation in the year 2000 would be the closest in terms of gameplay, fun and chaos, with the addition of a multiplayer mode having a sidecar attached to the bike, presenting interesting co-op elements to the experience, allowing you to team up or face off to brawl with friends while weaving through traffic. It was chaotic, hilarious and so much fun. The single player campaign kept things fresh with a variety of missions and more freedom to explore the game's levels. Jailbreak didn't reinvent the wheel, but it made the Road Rash experience more versatile and social than ever, at least at that time. After Jailbreak, however, the series went dormant, leaving fans wondering if we'd ever see a return. But the gaming landscape was changing, and while Road Rash experimented with 3D and new gameplay mechanics, it couldn't quite keep up with the times. But here's the thing, Road Rash did inspire a new generation of developers, releasing titles that we would see in modern times with games like Road Redemption and Road Rage that have somewhat picked up the torch, bringing combat racing into the next generation, taking all of the racing elements and formula, bringing it into the modern era, while also trying to relive the nostalgia of old. These games are a clear love letter to Road Rash with a mix of chaotic action, fast-paced racing and of course the brutal takedowns. They are fun titles in their own right, but they do pale in comparison to the series that inspired them. But I think it's definitely worth taking a look into each of the games in the original series to discuss their influences on racing games of the time, which we will do so here. The original Road Rash debuted on the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis in 1991 and would predominantly change the face of motorbike racing games from that point on, even with the racing genre as a whole, that mixed in combat elements into the gameplay with fast and frantic, chaotic encounters that would inevitably spawn a series of popular sequels later down the line. But even with the original game, because it was so popular on the console, it eventually would come to the point that ports would be added to different systems that would find its way to the Amiga, even as far as the Nintendo Game Boy, along with the Master System and Game Gear, Sega's 8-bit consoles of the time. But what was impressive with this was with the technology that was available, how they were able to get the game running with all of these elements on lesser powered systems, and if anything they play really well. While not as refined or as polished as the 16-bit entries, but they do a damn good job of being able to represent the original qualities of the first game in the series. And for many of us growing up, if you couldn't have access to a Mega Drive, which a lot of us didn't back then, if you had a Master System, a Game Boy or a Game Gear, which a lot of us would have had as an alternative, you still had a chance to play the game in its entirety. It was definitely the start of a unique era within video games of that time. The inevitable sequel with Road Rash 2 would release a short time later in 1992 on the Mega Drive also. They made some adjustments and tweaked the visuals and gameplay aesthetics with even more chaotic elements with the gameplay, combat, and also with one of the greatest soundtracks, which I consider to be among some of the best ever on the Mega Drive itself. But this would also introduce a new multiplayer split screen mode so that you could race against your mates, with the physical cartridge size being increased to incorporate all of those additional gameplay elements. Road Rash 2 would have been out a number of years before I first got to play the game, and it would be my first introduction into the series back in 1995 upon a mate getting a loan of it for a couple of weeks. And I remember vividly spending many weekends literally just playing the game in its entirety throughout the weekends and just having a blast with the chaotic nature of the gameplay, but even just the nature of the music within each of the levels. They were so quirky and catchy that the game itself did make a real impact, even so much to a point that I consider the soundtrack of this game to be among some of my favourite ever in video games, and I often go back to listen to it. It's still a fun game to play. For me, it's probably the best of the original 3 games on the Mega Drive itself. It's a very fun experience, and so much in a way that the game would also later be ported to the Nintendo Game Boy Color of all places in the year 2000, but would be rebranded simply under the Road Rash name. But it brought all of the quirky charm and nature to Nintendo's popular and tiny 8-bit handheld console at the time, and was impressive to see the game running on this system with a great level of detail, visuals, and does have a unique charm to the soundtrack, just like in the original game. Yeah, I definitely put this down as one of the best racing games I ever played. I'm sure you would agree. Road Rash 3 would release in 1995 among a sea of other ports and other versions of the games that were seeing home on other systems of the time. It would also be the final entry on the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis itself that would take a lot of the gameplay elements from the original 2 games but try to expand on it to try and make it the most definitive version possible on the console, and in many ways it did achieve that. It had a different visual style compared to the original 2 games, especially with the character sprites on screen, opting for more of a photographic sprite based element that would have been popular with many other games from other genres of that period, trying to make it more realistic, if you will, because other versions of Road Rash had now found their way onto other systems with the Panasonic 3DO and even the Sega CD that used these digitized sprites with a lot more detail. So Road Rash 3 did a really good job at trying to push the console to its limits in terms of its graphical capabilities for this representation. Now, while the game was positively received by critics and was commercially successful to a degree, it still didn't hit the height of popularity or overall success compared to the original 2 games, and for a variety of different reasons, because people at that point had been starting to move on to newer consoles of that generation with the PlayStation, the Sega Saturn. Even people were still playing games on the likes of the Sega CD that had better quality in terms of sound effects and just overall gameplay with visuals and so forth. And the soundtrack in the game, while it is very good, for me personally, haven't played the game, it just doesn't seem as memorable as the original 2 games. Now, it's not to say that it's bad, it's really good, but it just, there's something about it that just is different. In many ways it often puts me in mind of the likes of the Streets of Rage series, while it's in a different genre entirely. But the soundtracks, especially from the original 2 games, are among the best ever in video games in its history. So by the time the 3rd game came out in 1994, the soundtrack, while it was decent, just paled in comparison, was nowhere near the level of quality or even just impact compared to the original 2. And Road Rash 3 has that same type of element with with the series here on the Mega Drive. But it's not to say that it's a bad thing, because when it came out, it was among a sea of other titles that were starting to hit massive heights of success on other platforms. So it would have been primarily overshadowed because of the transition to newer consoles of the time. If anything, that was unfortunately its downfall, and it was through no fault of its own. It was just things were changing at the time in video games. But still, a worthwhile title, a fantastic entry in the series, especially on the Mega Drive, and still worth playing even to this day. Between 1994 and 1995, games consoles were focusing more on using CD-based formats for their games and outputs, and a re-envisioning of the series, simply under the name of Road Rash, would make its way to a multitude of different platforms, even among the Sega CD being among the first entries, that housed better graphics, gameplay, digitised sprites for the characters to make it look more realistic, and with epic rock-based soundtracks from well-known bands and groups of the time. The Sega CD version among all of these editions would also allow you to play the music tracks from the game within each of the races itself, which would really get you pumped up to get involved in the combat and just the chaos that would ensue. But with the other editions that would later release on the Panasonic 3DO along with the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and later in 1996 on the Windows PC, would still have the iconic soundtracks, but they wouldn't be used within the game levels themselves, more so in the menus. But each of the tracks that you would play on would all have their own individual gameplay themes that you could listen to, and they are very memorable in most ways. Among the best of them would be the Sega CD version itself. Among the best versions to hear those soundtracks would be on the Panasonic 3DO and PlayStation. The Sega Saturn and Windows PC, while the music was okay in the levels, they were very dumbed down compared to the quality of the previous two entries, which is kind of weird really, because we all know that the likes of those systems were well capable, but just for whatever reason there was some subtle changes in them. But it's not to say that they're bad games, they're excellent entries. If you're a fan of all series of Road Rash games, they're definitely worth a try. Now, while I didn't play a lot of the other versions up until more recent years, I did play the likes of the Windows PC version in the mid 2000s when I was at college, and I enjoyed that. But for me at the time, my favourite, and probably still my favourite version of all of the games, is the PlayStation version, because it was one of the earliest games I'd ever played on that console way back in Christmas of 1996, and I was just completely blown away by the level of detail, the speed, the frantic nature of the gameplay. It was everything like I remember from Road Rash 2 on the Sega Mega Drive, which I played about a year or so prior to it, but I just couldn't believe how chaotic this game was. But even with that, the music, and especially with the likes of the soundtracks, the effects, listening to the jukebox on the menu, that you could sit and listen to the music for hours on end, was just incredible. But even if you left it for a certain period of time, you would get hidden music videos from some of those artists to play on the screen. It kind of felt like you were watching a TV show, or even on MTV itself at the time, which was really epic. It was very reflective of its period, of its time, and it definitely showed. But I think that was what made it so cool. Yeah, for me, Road Rash on the PlayStation, but even among these other systems, is without a doubt one of the greatest games I've ever played during this generation. I still go back to play it every so often. It's just so good. But all parts of the game during this time, they're all worth playing. Make no mistake about that. They're all worth enjoying, regardless of which console you had access to back in the day. You should definitely give them a go. Road Rash 3D would be the first entry in the series to move away from the digitised sprite-based elements of the original series to focus on full 3D gameplay, with the main focus being more so on racing rather than combat. While the combat is still an important feature, the goal really is to win every race at all costs. It has a great soundtrack, very like the previous entries in the series, and would be exclusive to the PlayStation when it released in 1998. But while it was also the first game to utilise fully 3D visuals, it didn't feel as refined until later entries on the likes of the Nintendo 64, and even with the likes of Road Rash Jailbreak that released in 2000, which we will cover shortly, that really found the perfect mix or balance between the new versions and that of the older games. It's a very tricky game to master, and also isn't as refined, but it's still an interesting game for its time, which is also a good talking point to look at the differences between the newer style and the classic elements. They're both worth playing, but which would you prefer? That's really the important thing here. Road Rash 64 would end up finding a release on the Nintendo 64 console in 1999 and would be licensed and published by THQ. That would be an interesting move, taking this iconic series onto quite possibly the most powerful console that was seen at the time, at least before the Sega Dreamcast that released later that year. That took a lot of the elements seen previously in Road Rash 3D on the PlayStation but refined it somewhat, with more fast-paced and frantic gameplay that had been known in the series, while also interjecting some epic music and sound themes that are also iconic that really stood out. But in many ways the game is often seen as an actual port of Road Rash 3D from that of the PlayStation. The game itself didn't receive the greatest of reviews, mainly seen as average at the time, but it was still a worthwhile solid title, especially for Road Rash fans and if you had access to a Nintendo 64. And if anything, it's among some of the best racing games on that platform even to this day, so it definitely is worth trying just for that experience alone. Road Rash Jailbreak would be the final entry in the series that would first see life on the PlayStation in the year 2000, but would get a later port onto the Nintendo Game Boy Advance in 2003. And I think for many, if we compare it to the original titles, while this also moved into the realm of 3D, likes of Road Rash 64 and Road Rash 3D previously, I think that this was definitely the perfect balance or mix. It was more of the defining moment towards the end of the series that presented all of the classic and frantic gameplay elements of the original games, but managed to finally nail it when it came to the 3D aesthetics, as the gameplay was also fast, fun, frantic and just totally chaotic. But what made this game even more memorable was the addition of the multiplayer features or co-op elements, where you could use a sidecar that would be attached to the bike, so one player would be racing or steering the bike while the other person would be dealing out all of the punches and kicks and the combat, to work against other competitors, even other friends, across the many different modes, even trying to fend off against cops that would also be trying to hunt you down. While it boasts classic and very fun arcade elements, the emphasis at the time was on realism, but just the laugh out loud nature of the gameplay with its little quips and even the characters themselves being able to have one-liners, and just when you crash and you just go flying all over the place. The game is hilarious. It's very like the old school games, you just be laughing out loud the whole time. Even as I spent time playing this over the years and even getting back into it in more recent times, I've forgotten how fun it is. It's definitely one of the funniest racing games I've probably ever played, especially even on the PlayStation. It's just a blast to play with mates or even just by yourself. While it is tricky and it's challenging, but it mixes that challenge with just frantic and just fun nature. A really good balance between the two. Out of all of the games, if we exclude the original series or even the earlier games seen on the PlayStation, out of the original 3D entries, this is by far the best one. Definitely worth trying. Spiritual successors to the Road Rash series, made by fans, releasing later in 2017, 2018 and even in recent times, even on mobile devices, would try to recapture the glory days of this iconic series, while also adding in some additional elements that wouldn't have been seen in the original titles. And while they're interesting games to play in their own right, unfortunately they never hit the same mark or appeal of that of the original series. There's just something about the original Road Rash games that have really stood the test of time, that they're hard to beat, even hard to replicate in many ways, as they're also a reflection in a period of their time. But I think that anything the fans try to make in the modern landscape of things, even with all the impressive visuals and gameplay elements, there's just certain unique characteristics that they can't replicate that you can only find in the original games. But still, while they may not be as good, they are decent enough alternatives that are worth trying, especially if you're looking for more Road Rash fun and frantics. There clearly have been many attempts to revive the series, even as far as with some of the original series creators to work on new ideas over the years, but nothing solid as of yet has come to light. Looking back, it's clear that Road Rash was ahead of its time. It combined speed, aggression and a style in a way that no other game did or managed to do. Whether you're a fan of the Sega Mega Drive classics, the groundbreaking 3DO, PlayStation, Saturn and PC versions, or the chaotic fun of the 3D elements with games like Jailbreak, there's no denying the series' impact. And who knows, with the resurgence of retro-inspired games, maybe one day we will see a proper Road Rash reboot. But until then, we've got plenty of modern alternatives and those timeless classics to keep the spirit of Road Rash alive. If you enjoyed this look into the history of Road Rash and want to see more iconic game series that began on Sega consoles also get the same treatment, then you should check out this next video right here.